Tactics and Practice podcast.
Bonjour! Welcome to The Future Behind Us, a podcast series where I am meeting internationally renowned artists to discuss with them the stories behind works that have become iconic. I will be asking these artists about the technological, the ethical, or even the legal challenges that they have encountered while developing their project. And I will explore in their company how the meaning of their work has changed over these past 5, 10, or 20 years. My name is Régine Debatty. I am a blogger, an art critic, a curator, and my guests in the podcast series are Trevor Paglen, Nora Al-Badri, Hubert Morgan, Gilles Magid, Paolo Pedercini from MOLLEINDUSTRIA, Evan Ross, Mediengruppe Bitnik, Sanela Yaich, Pinar Yoldash, and Maya Srekar. In this episode, I am chatting with game developer, artist, and educator Paolo Pedercini from MOLLEINDUSTRIA. And action! Paolo Pedercini is a game developer, an artist, and an associate professor in Carnegie Mellon's School of Art in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is where he is also running LIKELIKE, a space for independent games and playful arts. Paolo Pedercini is the mind behind MOLLEINDUSTRIA, a radical video gaming project that addresses issues such as religion, the military, gun violence, mass incarceration, immigration, and even the Anthropocene. Commenting on his own games, Pedercini wrote, and I'm going to quote him, he wrote that he unintentionally convinced many people that his games are art. Hello, Paolo Pedercini. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
So, Paolo, let's kick off with a quote from one of my favorite philosophers. His name is Ricky Gervais. And he said, "You can laugh at anything. It depends on the joke." So my question to you is, does it apply to game? Like, do you think that you can turn pretty much any socio-political problem into a playful experience? Or have you found that over the years that there are kind of no-go zones?
Yes, there are certainly no-go zones. So there are definitely certain things that I cannot turn into games. Sometimes because I don't just see a gameplay in there. And sometimes because it just doesn't doesn't feel right. There is an aspect of trivialization that comes with games, play and fun and the association to them. For example, my most recent game, I was looking for a way to tackle the current war in Gaza, genocide in Gaza, and I felt like the only way I could approach it with my usual dark humor and satire was from the angle of how the newspapers are talking about it. Like, I could never make a game when, that is somewhat depicting the violence that is happening. It will be really hard.
I was wondering, could you make a game about the upcoming elections in the US, or is it just to game naturally?
Yeah, I think so. I'm less interested in the elections, but yeah, I've been prototyping ideas on that extent. Not so much the current election, the media circus around the elections, but I'm interested in how grassroots movements are operating in the primaries, so like the elections before the elections that are kind of more important to some extent. And how, there are essentially movements and groups with not a lot of money, but a lot of volunteer can influence the elections and can influence the candidates that end up on the main ballot. So I think there has been, an electoral movement in the United States in the last 6 to 10 years that wasn't there before. And there are, strategies and ideas and practices that are, I think, also worth explaining and bringing to the foreground for a larger audience. Because those are the kind of communities and groups and associations that I'm part of.
Right. One thing I notice, and I think anybody can notice if they go on your website, is that you do not shy away from delicate topics. And as a result, some of your games have been the subject of controversies. So I'm thinking about Operation Pedo Priest, which was a game you launched in 2007 about pedophile priest, and that game was heavily attacked by an Italian politician who accused it of offending human and religious sensitivity. I think even managed to get or you had to take the game down. I don't remember exactly. But 2 years later, representatives of several religions described your game, Faith Fighter, as being deeply provocative and disrespectful. And then 2011, your game Phone Story about the dark side of the mining, manufacturing, and mass consumption of smartphone was banned from the Apple iTunes Store. So because of all these examples, and probably there are others, is controversy something that you expect or something that you even look for? Because, when there is a scandal or when there is a debate, there is a lot of attention and discussion. So do you welcome this kind of controversy and critiques?
I think that was definitely a component of what I was doing at the very beginning. Those were a subject, like just the idea of having a game on certain subject was already considered controversial in a way that is not anymore to some extent. So it was actually pretty easy to do controversy with video games back then. I think now people will just simply ignore it, but games like that. But yeah, definitely that was something that I was interested in. But also I kind of like realized that there are some limitation in that mode of, I guess, like communication or intervention. Mostly because, for example, the controversy related to Faith Fighter was based not so much on the game in itself, but based on what British tabloids were saying about the game itself. So it was essentially facing a situation in which people were starting, or even like in that case, kind of like intentionally mounting a controversy based on the fact that, based on essentially on descriptions or secondhand description or what they were imagining what the game was, they will be essentially calling, representatives of, Muslim communities and Catholic communities and asking for their opinion on this game, but not let them play or not encouraging them to play it. So like the game to me expressed a pretty, a little bit of a nuance and a pretty clearly, satirical sort of like angle that I think people that were commenting on it didn't get. So essentially my problem was that controversy, and that was also the case on another controversy that was happening at that time with Wafa Bilal, who made a game about, Iraq and so on, that, basically commentators were not playing the game and accepting or like imagining what the game was, essentially, because apparently it is still allowed for a journalist to comment on games without playing them. So that issue, I tackled it in a bit of a different way with Phone Story. And I kind of designed that game in a way that was pretty clear what the game was about, even by just looking at a screenshot, essentially. So in a way, it was like a bit simpler and a little bit more straightforward in its interpretation or in its deployment of this sort of message. But yes, it was almost designed to be understandable, even if the game was going to be banned, and to not be misunderstood in that way.
It's interesting what you say, because I remember when you started doing this kind of critical independent games, which was, I think you started in 2003, right?
Yes.
So that was 20 years ago. And at the time, there were not that many people doing critical, socially engaged video games like the one you're doing. And so some players and certainly some game critics found them, let's say, strange and exotic because the focus was not on the thrill of the gameplay. So if I remember, it was not like some people found it simply really weird. So has the perception changed? And do you find that now, 20 years later, the public and the game critic understand it better? And that there's also a strong independent community, a game community that has evolved and that was not there 20 years ago. So has the landscape radically changed in over the course of the past 20 years.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think the audiences have changed. There is more criticism. There are more, even, mainstream journalists that grew up with video games. And so they don't have they're not sort of like stuck in very like old-timey controversy about video games or whether video games make, children violent, that kind of stuff that was popular in the 90s. So yeah, there's definitely like more understanding and less intentional misunderstanding. But in regard to controversy, there is perhaps a problem that now social media are sort of like actively, algorithmically encouraging kind of like bad takes and controversies. So I'm also less interested in that mode of provoking, because it's just so integrated and so like integrated in the dominant discourse. And that's essentially how the right wing works, by just throwing controversy and try to generate little, skirmishes in this ongoing culture wars.
So your woke games, huh?
Yeah, so I'm trying to make things that are not fueling that sort of like direct confrontation.
But does it mean that you kind of self-censor yourself, or that you try to wrap your games differently, your message differently?
I think that just provocation and controversy might not always be the best mode.
If I look back at now and compare to 20 years ago, I'm wondering if the indie and the experimental game community has had any influence on the mainstream gaming industry, because I notice, at least in media art, that, I don't know, advertisers or people doing entertainment or people developing devices and technology, sometimes they are influenced by what artists are doing. I mean, when I say influenced, I put it very mildly. Sometimes they copy. So it's something like that happening with gaming.
Yeah, absolutely. The industry, let's say like the two sides of the industry, the independent side, more underground side, and the mainstream high budget side are actually very integrated, and there is quite a big gradient between the two and quite a bit of a flow of talent, ideas, because, underground, independent developers do play a AAA game. They admire that. A lot of them aspire to become, maybe like the art directors of a big budget game, which is a little bit different from maybe like if you're thinking of like, the relationship between, art and advertising, or the relationship between independent, underground movies and Hollywood movies that are a little bit more confrontational, more antagonistic. I think like the relationship between independent games and mainstream games is a little bit more integrated and a little bit more fluid. And, a lot of independent games have changed the course of the medium. Like Minecraft was basically an independent game made by mostly one guy, right? And there are plenty of examples like that. I would say like a lot of the most popular sort of like phenomenon among us and whatnot are often from independent games. And then they sort of like become bigger, and they get bigger publisher and bigger budgets and so on.
I'm going to throw at you a quote. I was reading an interview with you in a magazine. The interview is a couple of years old, but you said in it that, I believe that if we want to have an effective impact on society, we must influence pop culture. So does it mean that your work doesn't naturally belong in art museums and galleries?
Yes, in a way, yes. I think I'm trying to remember the context for that quote, but I was probably maybe talking about what the cultural context in which MOLLEINDUSTRIA was born was still essentially the Berlusconi era. This millionaire that basically came to power by controlling every sector of pop culture, by controlling TV stations and not journalism, and not like very like hard information, but rather more like lightweight entertainment, by importing very specific TV shows that were like apologists, other billionaires, and so on. And he controlled books and magazines and so on. So to me, the importance of intervening in pop culture was related to that, and it's still related to that. I think there is a space for experimental culture that is art as almost like a sandbox for where unthinkable, unmarketable thing can happen. And it's valuable to have that, but I wouldn't consider that as the end point of every, not the end point, but the aspirational point for every cultural producer. It's like, if you do something that is good enough, then it becomes art. No, I think that's just one context in which culture can exist, and it has problems of, sort of like insularity or self-referentiality. I think most of the time I'm not interested in engaging an audience that essentially understands and gets everything that I'm saying, and that is essentially just looking for experiences that are confirming that kind of ideas, or that are perhaps, providing more like sort of like elevated perspective on certain topics and subjects. So on the other hand, I also do understand that the usefulness of having a devoted space for art, like museums and galleries, and to the point that I created my own in my garage, is basically an art gallery for independent and experimental video games. So I think there is a value in opening a physical space in which people sort of like walk in randomly, and they get exposed in this sort of focused way to specific works that might even be available on the internet, but having them almost like on a pedestal, or presented in a context, in a specific way, or within a themed exhibition and so on, or in a social environment, which is also part of what art is. That, like, there is a value in that, I think.
Yeah, I remember seeing a phone story. I think it was at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and there was a phone and a description of your phone story, and that was it. And it was really a nice exhibition, but I found the way phone story was exhibited was a bit limited.
Yeah, that part of my mission is also, it's a bit in polemic and in response to how often games are presented in art contexts. Like, for example, in non-interactive ways, or in ways that are maybe like neutralizing some crucial aspects. Like, if you are seeing how games are presented at the MoMA, they are sort of like showing Pac-Man, but they are like removing the cabinet. They are removing fairly important things in order to make it fit a little bit better in the modernist, the minimalist aesthetic that one expects from a museum of modern art. And I think kind of like dumb and incorrect. And with my zero budget garage gallery, I strive to do better.
Okay, since we talk about phone story, to me it's a classic, because the way it depicts the exploitation of workers in the coltan mine, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in the Chinese factories, in e-waste recycling fields in Ghana, I think they've been a shock, and they've informed a lot of mobile phone users about the conditions in which our devices are made. And Phone Story, I think, was released in 2011, and unfortunately, the problems it was exposing are still very much present today. And I think it's the case with many of the games that you've developed over the years, whether it's 5, 10, or 15 years ago, they have remained very pertinent today. And in a sense, it's a bit disturbing. I mean, it's great because, your games are classic. But then on the other hand, I'm wondering, what do you feel about that as an artist? Is it a bit depressing to see that there's so little impact? So why do you think it's still important to create art that engage directly with the problems of this world? Even though you probably know that the games are not going, or the artwork are not going to magically solve any problem that you look at.
Yes, there is this thing that artists often strive to make work that is eternal, immortal, or it's a classic, and stays relevant for a long time. And in my case, it's not quite the case, because I wish certain issues would be solved. In fact, sometimes people ask me about preservation or technological obsolescence. How do I make sure that my games remain playable for the next 10, 20, 30 years? And I'm more like, well, if my games are still relevant and like 20 years from now, we have bigger problems, right? But that's definitely the case for Phone Story in a way, because even recently there were like some new images of basically slaves in the Democratic Republic of Congo mining coltan, and they are exactly the same as the images that I was using as reference for this game back in 2009 or 10. But I also would like, especially in relationship to Phone Story, I also don't want to be too gloomy. Like certain issues are still unsolved and are still, in the process of being debated and discussed. But a lot of progress has happened. Like there have been some victories in the right to repair, for example. So the way Phone Story worked is that it was used as a fundraiser, as a way to collect money for certain associations that were working on the issues presented in the game. So it wasn't just about raising awareness of certain issues, but it was also about showcasing some of the groups that are on the front line and actually doing things on the front of, for example, like labor rights in China, or certification for electronics, conflict minerals, and things like that. So over the course of the years, Phone Story was basically all the money, the very little money that the game made through sales or exhibition fees and so on, had been donated to various associations. So, for example, one of the association was promoting the right to repair, essentially lobbying legislators to allow people to repair phones and extend their life cycles. Obviously, phone manufacturers don't like that. They will rather you throw away your phone every couple of years and get a new one. So there has been advancement in that on that front. The workers in Foxconn factory have been striking and have been sort of like claiming and more better working conditions and higher wages, and there's an aspect of international pressure as well, meaning that yes, of course, the strike and the worker organization is what drives that effort. But because the factory is producing so much work that is sort of like public facing, and so much work that is so much commodities and phones and electronics that are very highly branded, like Apple is a valuable brand. Because of that, I think they felt the pressure from this kind of campaigns and the kind of like mobilization and discourse that was happening at the time, and it keeps happening around electronics.
That's interesting. I'm not used to having uplifting answers to my question. I'm now
I don't know if it's uplifting, to be honest, but yes, some things change. I think some things improved. I think it's not nearly enough, obviously.
No, but you're right about the right to repair. I don't know how is the state of the right to repair in the US, but I know in Europe at least things are moving. They've been moving slowly, but yeah. That's a good point you made. So now I would like to do a small experiment with you. Yesterday, I was looking online for websites that try to forecast the future, and they were looking at the future of gaming. So I'm going to throw some of these trends at you, and you tell me whether or not you find them exciting. So let's start. So as an artist, as a player, as a citizen, are you excited by? And the first one is augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality in gaming.
No. I think all this sort of like family of technology have interesting potentials, and artists will take this technology and make amazing things with them. However, especially when talking about VR and the metaverse, in the way that the current sort of like a player, or I would say even Facebook actually kind of abandoned that, but like Meta/Facebook is the last remaining hope for VR in a way. And the way, and I would say also Apple, I guess they have, the new device that nobody was kind of expecting. But those two visions of VR are kind of like the worst possible scenario, in that they are not really enabling anything new or anything experimental or interesting. Like the whole premise of VR that was actually starting from the 90s with Jaron Lanier, that is a little bit more psychedelic, more like mind expanding. The idea that you are putting this headset on and you are in a completely different world, seeing the world from different eyes and things like that. You can maybe like consider considered maybe like naive, and there is critique that can happen in that. But still, it was about, kind of like enabling new possibilities. Whereas the way that both Apple and Meta see the metaverse and virtual reality is essentially a screen that is stuck to your face. It is basically a screen that you cannot look away from. And they see as almost like the last mile for the attention economy, meaning that, both Apple and Facebook are constantly looking to keep your eyes and your eyeballs stuck to a screen. And they see the AR and VR as that kind of like screen that ideally you don't ever take off. And ideally they can be the layer, the sort of like the intermediate layer between you and the world outside, you and the reality outside. But so that's the kind of like the fantasy from the perspective of the capital, essentially, from the perspective of, of the tech company. The reality of it is that you're basically going to have like all they are proposing is a version of the same apps, of the same uses, except in that kind of like immersive space, which is, I think, quite unappealing. And you have to just live in San Francisco to be excited about it.
I think it would be interesting. We're not going to do that, but I'm trying to guess what what you're going to say to the following: e-sport competitions. Exciting, but
no, not exciting. Esports, I think, have had a moment of extreme popularity, and they are still quite popular. But it is hard to understand where the genuine interest ends and the financial bubble starts, because these esports are essentially like big advertisement for the gaming company, and they are like heavily funded and heavily sponsored and subsidized by the gaming companies, right? It's different from an actual sport that, yes, they have like, all sort of interests attached to them, but you're not actually playing a product. When you're thinking of soccer, it is not owned by a company that defines the rules and also, promotes these championships and gives money. And so like, a lot of the esport fad is essentially like a bubble is like inflated in the hope that they will become the next, NFL or the next FIFA. I think they will stay, relevant to a niche, but I don't see anything particularly interesting in terms of, culture, I guess.
Okay, the next one is generative AI, to which I added generative AI stealing your job as a game designer.
I don't think AI will, for example, automate the elite cultural production, like at the level of completely stealing people's jobs or reducing creativity. Like Disney will not use AI to entirely generate a new character design or something like that. They will still use human because humans are kind of better. However, there is a whole class of visual artistic labor that is kind of like lower level, that is about, I don't know, making terrible songs for the background of a commercial or making an illustration for a terrible magazine. So there's all that kind of like cheap and I would say like intro level creative jobs that are going to be eaten out by AI. Because, if you just need like a little illustration for a magazine, you might as well just generate one in 1 second rather than paying an intern or a junior, like, a couple of $100, right? Because it's not particularly valuable. It doesn't have to be cutting edge or anything. So my concern with that is that those jobs are essentially entry job for a whole set of creatives that they have to, in order to become good illustrators, they have to make pretty mediocre illustrators for magazines. Or in order to be able to do more cutting edge work or more like important work, they have to subsist, they have to make money to pay their bills with kind of like lower level gigs that are, again, like an illustration for a magazine or a soundtrack, like a soundtrack for a commercial. So I think that will damage both directly and indirectly the creative industry ecosystem, I think. And we'll also, in the process, we'll also have wars things, wars illustrations, wars music. And my only hope is that maybe like the only positive thing is that certain tropes, since AI generators, both in music, text, and images, what they tend to do is basically compile patterns that are out there. And so if you are typing something like, make me a steampunk girl, they will make you somewhat good steampunk girl illustration, Midjourney, or things like that. But mostly because steampunk is such a established genre, it's like a cliche, it's a trope. And so I think the facility with which you can now basically barf established trope will encourage, I think, illustrators, musicians, and writers to just make weirder stuff in order to differentiate themselves from the endless sludge that we are going to be submerged with by working for free.
I have one last curiosity, and I mean, it's a bit of a personal question, so we can edit it out if you don't feel like answering it. But how long have you been living and working in Pittsburgh?
Since 2009.
Okay. And have you considered moving back to Europe? Because I think people like you, love you in Europe even, or is it like, is Europe not ready for Paolo Pedercini because maybe you have fewer job opportunities, and I know Pittsburgh is nice, but...
I know. Yeah, I know people do love me in Europe, probably more than the United States. But yeah, it is, like I never really worked hard to stay in the United States. It just kind of happened. And what is it?
For you.
Yeah, like I know, like it's an extremely privileged thing to say, considering that there are so many people that are just working so hard to just like get a visa or so on. But yeah, like so because of that, I'm very settled here, community wise, and settlement wise. So I don't like it will be hard to get me out of this cushy position. It will be something major happening maybe at the next election cycle. But also I'm not quite a believer of the idea that you have to move to the most comfortable place possible and live the most comfortable way. Because, yeah, I sort of had that choice. I could move to, Canada or something and be in a much gentler and welfare state equipped country and so on. But I don't know, maybe that's not the solution to the problems I'm trying to address. I don't know. It is, maybe I work best when I'm kind of miserable,
Oh, okay. Well, Europe will have to wait. And I think we can close the conversation here. So thank you so much for your time, Paolo. I'm really glad I got this opportunity to catch up with you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to end with a quick message to the listeners. Do check out Paolo Pedercini's website. It's MOLLEINDUSTRIA.org with double L. And also, if you have a chance to play with the New York Times simulator, that's his newest game, and it's looking at the so-called liberal newspapers in the US, but I think it can apply to so many newspapers in Europe, and how these new newspapers have biases when it comes to covering contentious political issues. Earlier you mentioned the Palestinian struggle, but also police misconduct and migration. And as a player, you have to juggle between serving the ruling class and making sure that the readers will continue to be entertained. I got kicked out quite rapidly. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you, Paolo. Thank you to our listeners. Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao. Bye.
That's it for this episode. Thank you for listening. The Future Behind Us is a podcast series conceived and conducted by me, Régine Debatty, for the 25th edition of the Pixel Point Festival curated by Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art as part of Go 2025 Nova Gorizia, European Capital of Culture. Thank you to Yanis fucking Yansha for the invitation to take on this challenge and for his precious collaboration and assistance in the curatorial process. Thank you also to Marcela Okritic for the impeccable coordination. The editing, the music, and the audio post-production are all by Gašper Torkar. Next week, artist Evan Ross will talk to us about the materiality of the internet, the biases built into digital systems, and why we do not need to like, comment, and interact in order to connect with other people. All episodes are available at aksioma.org/podcast, on the website of the Pixel Point Festival, and on all major podcast platforms by typing Tactics and Practice in the search bar. For more information on the context, the participants, and the partners involved, see the link in the description. That's it for now. Bye everyone. Au revoir.